Is liberty a value? This is our question for today. In your work you challenged this idea. Literally, you wrote, "First, instead of comparing forms of society, its constituent principle was analyzed at different levels of society, throughout different steps of the process. From the individual person towards the social community and its environment. Second, even unorthodox for liberal anarchist theories, this study proposed to understand liberty neither as a goal, nor as a value, but is the underlying first principle constituent for all forms of social life. Now the question is, that apparently the proposition of liberty as first principle is also a value in itself."
An excellent question. In fact, I myself did not consider the possibility that liberty could be anything else than a value. Even when I was working with the metaphysics in Plotinus' Enneads, in which liberty was defined as a priori, and which he, among others, also described as the one or pure potentiality. Even then, I was thinking of liberty as a value.
So, what made you change idea?
Perhaps, before answering this question, it would be better to resume why it is so common to think that liberty is a value. In general, the concept of liberty is approached in epistemology. This is also the case of your question made before. Liberty is taken as an attribute from a linguistic point of view. This means that you consider the possibility that objects of thought can be either free or unfree. Perhaps this could even be understood in a gradual way as something more or less free. Epistemology is the science of knowledge, and as such it deals with questions about what can be known, by which means it can be known, and why at all something is relevant to be known. Liberty plays a role as element for testing. The basic question in my research would be, is a person free, or is there something like free will or free action? And if affirmative, could it be free? Let's see the next slide. With such an approach, Mencken, for example, believed that government in general opposes liberty. Thus he uses liberty as a negative value. Sallust, similarly, described liberty as a value, or rather an ideal, which is searched only by few. It seems that he regrets this. Thus, you are right, in general, philosophy seems to understand liberty as an ideal value to strive for or to limit. I will shortly resume how values are defined. The Oxford Dictionary describes them as the worth of things, a standard of behavior, an absolute or relative amount in mathematics, music, linguistics, and even arts. As mentioned before, liberty in this sense is a measuring tool. All right, in the next step we could compare this with the definition of a priori. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy gives a simple definition for the term a priori, a first principle. According their understanding, it is the implication or foundation of a logical proposition, a requirement that something can be held true or false. And it doesn't rely on any empirical evaluation. It is an implication made by logic only. This means that according to the Oxford Dictionary's definition of value, if liberty were such a value, it would have to measure something in order to prove a statement as true or false. Considering liberty as a priori, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia, it had to establish a kind of frame on which the statement relied.
Could you give an example?
Well, for instance, a value of color could be red, which is conceived as a certain range of wavelength of light, a U. But in order to test that something is red, we need the framework which defines what colors are and why they have different values. The a priori of concrete colors is the concept of color as part of human light perception. This concept is intuitive, experienced, but is also part of a logical frame, the idea that light is a wave, which has the property of length. The second approach to liberty as the first principle of existence was found in Plotinus. He did not discuss about liberty as something that could be more or less desirable, something to fight or to keep under control. Within Plotinian philosophy, this would make no sense. For Plotinus, at least if we can believe Jesus de Garay, liberty is the origin of logic itself, and all other logical concepts as much as concrete existence. He defined it as the pure potentiality of being or not being, becoming manifest or hiding, imposing power or weakness as a perpetuated acting. Truth values, existence, and the forces going on in this world implied that there was the potential itself. First, of its own negation, in Hegelian sense, but also of the suspension of any decision between affirmation or negation. Liberty is a pre-logical moment from which everything becomes possible, or is possible. Plotinus also associated to the theological concept of the divine, but this is not important for the question here. For me, the question came up by defining the phenomenon of personhood without the need to rely on material standards. Usually persons are simply defined as human beings, species-bound. Yet even those approaches have difficulty to distinguish the living person, the human being alive, from the death corpse. The problem at the end is the same. Coming from this side, my research approached the phenomenon of the person rather from a methodological point. The question was, how could something be known? I owed much of the further insight to the theory of Hans Hermann Hoppe's argumentation ethics. Without entering into details, he suggested that truth values could be tested through argumentation. This concerned not only truth values on content knowledge or conceptual issues, but relevant for him also standards for ethical interaction could be set through argumentation. The very performance of arguing was for Hoppe a proof that you could not negate the other discourse partner through argumentation without breaking up the argumentative performance. You might keep silence, neglecting the other, but if you say, "You do not exist," this is already an interaction with the other. He goes even further by establishing rights, especially the right to live from this mechanism, based on a Lockean conception of the person, property and rights. However, Hoppe's ethics is much criticized, prominently by Robert Murphy and G. Callahan.
However, Hans Hermann Hoppe's ethics is much criticized, prominently by Robert Murphy and Jean Callahan.
Yes, and in my understanding, these critiques were well refuted by Marianne Eabrasu in 2009. But surprisingly, most critiques, including those scholars, target at issues which did not further bother me. What was at stake for me, and as I believe, what is relevant for today's ethics, was the question How could I know during the performance of an argumentation that the discourse partner was a real person? I know at first hand this sounds stupid, but think of modern technologies. What makes you know that you are not speaking to a computer?
Never thought about this.
The problem became even more tricky. Some researchers in artificial intelligence found out that what made a speech more agreeable, because more human-like, was the fact that it included grammatical and semantic incorrectness, mistakes. This seemed to contradict Hoppe's idea that performative contradiction was not allowed. Actually, different forms of contradiction were much more frequent in natural language than could be expected. Thus, my question was not so much in finding out if or if not someone in concrete was a person, a human, whatever, but how we could measure it all, how we came to this conclusion. Here I repeat the extract. First, instead of comparing forms of society, its constituent principle was analyzed at different levels of society, throughout different steps of process, from the individual person towards the social community and its environment. Second, even unorthodox for liberal anarchist theories, this study proposed to understand liberty neither as a goal nor as a value, but as the underlying first principle, constituent for all forms of social life. What I did was looking for the possibilities, the potential of making deliberate errors throughout the whole constituent process, starting from the individual level up to the social construction of society. I was searching for signs of genuine liberty in the social sphere. This turned out to be a real quest. Resuming, there are two different approaches to problems. One is a comparative one. This belongs to conventional science and searches for representations of reality in data, concluding later in deductions and analogies. The other approach was to explore something in a performative way by manipulating it, not in the sense of a conventional experiment, but further beyond as an interpersonal interaction. It was not the representation I looked for, but to explore the limits in the possibilities of manipulation.
You manipulated former's texts. Right.
That's correct. More concrete, I was concerned with the possibility to modify a text without losing its meaning, nor falsifying any empirical facts. The interesting insight was that the only borderline I found was the audience. Out of data, almost any interpretation could be given. What is more, through the dynamics of propaganda, as described by Dramatica, the message was completely arbitrary, but it was still limited by the need to be understood and accepted by the discourse partner. This brings us back to Hoppe's idea, to use the other in discourse as a measuring tool. Thus, the insight was not so much that we could manipulate, coerce each other, but that the very possibility of coercion required liberty, first, as a framework. It was not an opposing value to coercion as often thought, but the condition that such a thing like coercion could exist.
Thank you, Dr. Hirzel. We will speak more about the implications that arise from liberty as a priori in our next discussion.
Thank you.